Who among Dexter's many rivals truly rattled his cage, and who simply ended up another notch on his table? When you follow Dex, you realize not all of his targets put up the same fight. Some are downright terrifying, while others are more like pit stops on his unstoppable highway of vigilante justice. In this little journey, I am about to rank several killers Dexter brought down, placing them into tiers based on how dangerous, cunning, or even haunting they turned out to be. Stick around if you're curious to see who nearly broke Dexter's code, and who barely scratched the surface of his nightmares. Now, before we dive in, here's a quick rundown of the tier names. We're calling the top level Nightmare Fuel, which speaks for itself. These adversaries are the worst news. Below that is Danger Zone, where you'll find deadly enemies who gave Dexter a real run for his money. Next up is Lethal Sparks, reserved for those menacing but still flawed threats Dexter managed to outmaneuver in the end. Then there's Weaker Prey, covering killers who were formidable in their own corners but didn't quite stand a chance once Dexter zeroed in. Finally, there's Short Work, your typical bad guys who were basically put out of commission the moment Dexter decided so. Good? Great. Let's talk shop. The first name that springs to mind is Travis Marshall, also known as the Doomsday Killer. I want you to picture this. A desperate man convinced he's part of some grand biblical prophecy to bring about the world's end, heavy on the religious symbolism, painting horrifying tableaus and going to extreme lengths to spread his twisted beliefs. If you recall, Travis had a split personality issue where he believed his mentor was leading him. That blend of religious obsession and mental instability made him wildly unpredictable, forcing Dexter to tread carefully. Dexter is usually methodical, but Travis tested his patience by staging gruesome end-of-the-world scenes. This was no routine kill. It took Dexter some real problem-solving to pin him down. In the end, though, once the mania was exposed, Dexter methodically dismantled Travis's illusions. I'd say it was a tense, high-stakes cat-and-mouse game, one that showed just how resourceful Travis could be when threatened. Ultimately, Dexter overcame him, but it was no walk in the park. So, for me, Travis belongs firmly in the danger zone. If you don't want to end up on the table, you better attack the subscribe button now. Moving right along, we have George King, famously known as the Skinner. If you're squeamish about torture, this guy probably haunts your nightmares. His signature move was skinning victims to extract information. Painful, brutal, and psychologically scarring. Whenever you have a killer who specializes in torture, you know they have a high threshold for violence. Dexter had to worry not just about being killed, but about being put through unimaginable agony first. Even so, George King's technique, while terrifying, was somewhat limited by his single-minded approach. He was the type who might adapt if threatened, but his hallmark was intimidation through physical suffering. Dexter, on the other hand, had no intention of letting King get a chance to turn the tables. Once Dexter set his sights on him, the plan was efficient, with Dexter ensuring he remained the hunter, not the hunted. King did put up a fight, sure, but it was ultimately not enough. I'd say he lands in Lethal Sparks. Definitely dangerous, but Dexter still managed to exploit openings in King's method. Now let's talk about a name that might ring some early series bells. Mike Donovan. Remember him? He was Dexter's very first on-screen kill, which sort of set the tone for the entire show. Mike Donovan was a horrid child predator, a monstrous person by all accounts. But from Dexter's standpoint, not much of a challenge. Donovan was caught relatively fast, leaving a trail that a bloodhound could follow. Dexter took him out with chilling ease, like the perfect demonstration of his code in action. No one's excusing Donovan's evil, but in terms of actual threat level to Dexter, zero. It was a straightforward takedown, so Donovan definitely falls into short work. As soon as Dexter had the evidence, it was game over. Next up is Zoe Krueger, a police officer who murdered her own family and tried to cover it up. That's next level disturbing. Someone trained in law enforcement, using those skills to orchestrate her crimes. She knew forensic procedures, how to navigate investigations, and how to manipulate the system to her advantage. To me, that makes her downright lethal because she was essentially working within the same framework Dexter did, but twisted it for personal gain. Dexter recognized the threat. Krueger could have pinned any suspicious activity on him if he wasn't careful. Still, her arrogance was her downfall. She assumed she was untouchable. Once Dexter caught on to the details that didn't add up, he moved in with stealth and precision. Even though she posed a genuine risk, she made a few fatal errors. I'd rank her in Lethal Sparks, because she had the cunning to be a serious threat, but not enough to keep Dexter off her trail indefinitely. Now consider Ken Olson, a smaller character with an outsized effect, if only because he was a catalyst who nudged Miguel Prado further into the darkness. Olson was a scumbag, sure, but in terms of complexity, he didn't stand out as a mega-villain who cornered Dexter. Once you see how Dexter operates, you quickly realize Ken had no real defenses. He was merely another killer whose methods, while cruel, never quite rose to the cunning or scale of the big boys. Once Dexter had him in his crosshairs, the outcome was inevitable. So for me, Ken Olson is weaker prey. Not incompetent, but absolutely no match for Dexter once the chase was on. Shifting gears to Oliver Saxon, also known as the brain surgeon. This guy was methodical, leaving behind chillingly precise crime scenes, removing specific portions of the brain from his victims. More than just savage, Saxon was calculating, and his kills often had a twisted logic behind them. He was a final major challenge for Dexter in the show's main run, which elevates him beyond your garden variety psycho. Where Saxon tripped up was in underestimating the emotional bonds Dexter had formed, especially regarding Deb. That emotional angle fueled Dexter to be more driven than ever. And when Dexter is focused, there's very little that can stop him. Yet, I can't ignore how close Saxon came to inflicting permanent damage. That makes him prime, danger zone, material. Dangerous, cunning, but ultimately outplayed. In stark contrast, Roger Hicks is next. He's what I like to call a vacation killer, the type who gets off on targeting unsuspecting tourists or people passing through. Remember though, he was sloppy enough that Dexter found him without breaking a sweat. Hicks depended on transients. Random victims, no immediate connection. But with Dexter's investigative mind, that level of chaos wasn't exactly an impenetrable shield. Dexter systematically identified him and swept him off the board. Given how easily Dexter cornered him, Roger Hicks squarely belongs in short work. Walter Kenny, the so-called Tooth Fairy Killer, was a murderer who liked to keep trophies, specifically teeth. He was once a terrifying force in his prime, but by the time Dexter found him, Kenny was older and losing his edge. The biggest tragedy here might be that Kenny longed for the glory days of his murder spree, but all he got was Dexter ending it for good. Even so, we can't completely dismiss the terror Kenny once brought. The difference is that Dexter targeted him at a time when Kenny simply wasn't the unstoppable monster he used to be. As a result, he didn't push Dexter to any extremes. That's weaker prey territory without question. Next, let's bring up Ray Speltzer, sometimes referred to as the Minotaur Killer. He liked building elaborate mazes, forcing victims to run for their lives, all while wearing a Minotaur-style helmet. The physical threat here was massive. Ray was a powerhouse with a violent streak a mile wide. Surviving him was no small feat, and if Dexter hadn't played it smart, he could have easily been overpowered in a direct confrontation. Still, when Speltzer's spree brought him to Dexter's attention, the advantage shifted. Dexter carefully studied Ray's routine, capitalized on his impulsive tendencies, and staged a takedown that neutralized that raw strength. Ray might have been formidable, but in a mental duel, Dexter generally reigns supreme. That's why I'll place him under Lethal Sparks, a big, dangerous bully who could break bones, but not the cunning cat who was hunting him. Then we have EMT Meridian, a manipulative psychiatrist who preyed on the vulnerable. His entire MO revolved around twisting people's minds, nudging them to commit suicide or harm themselves. And that's horrifying on a psychological level. Dexter had to see through layers of deception, but once he recognized Meridian was behind multiple suspicious deaths, it wasn't long before he orchestrated a private session with him. Though therapy in Dexter's world has a very different meaning. Meridian was no physical threat, nor did he have a broad network. His power was purely in mental manipulation, and that doesn't hold up well against Dexter's unwavering code. Meridian found himself on Dexter's table, and it wasn't exactly a cliffhanger. I'm putting him in weaker prey. Let's pause for a moment and talk about a heavyweight, Jordan Chase, the charismatic self-help guru with a terrifying cult leader vibe. If you recall, he used his influence to orchestrate the brutal Barrel Girl killings, letting others do much of the dirty work while he quietly pulled the strings. Chase got under Dexter's skin in a way many others didn't, because he challenged Dexter on a psychological level, tempting him to embrace his darkest impulses without guilt. This was a mind game from start to finish. Jordan Chase had resources, a public persona that made him nearly untouchable, and a silver tongue that could rationalize any horror. Dexter had to be extremely strategic, peeling back each layer of Chase's operation. It was intense, and for a while it seemed like Chase might manage to slip away. Ultimately though, Dexter overcame him, but that's no small feat. Chase was powerful, manipulative, and absolutely vile. That's pure nightmare fuel. Next on our list is Lyla West, the wild card who nearly burned Dexter's life literally to the ground. She wasn't your garden variety killer. She was an arsonist, an enabler, and dangerously obsessive. Lyla inserted herself into Dexter's personal life, discovered his secrets, and even threatened to reveal them all. That level of closeness made her a real liability. She wasn't the strongest physically, but she was cunning in how she manipulated situations, especially with the threat of fire. One spark, and Dexter's entire life could go up in flames. Dexter had to be extra vigilant, but once he decided Lyla was a threat that had to go, he tackled it the same way he tackles everything: find the weakness and strike. Lyla was resourceful but not unstoppable. I'd mark her under lethal sparks because she definitely made Dexter sweat, but ultimately she was out of her depth. Boyd Fowler was the unassuming accomplice who helped dispose of the Barrel Girl victims by collecting roadkill, and then some. His job was to make bodies disappear, which is creepy enough, but he was part of a larger ring. Boyd himself wasn't a meticulous mastermind. He was a cog in a darker machine. Once Dexter caught wind of his pattern, there was little Boyd could do except hope his secrets stayed buried. Spoiler, they didn't. Dexter quickly outmaneuvered him. He's absolutely weaker prey, creepy and methodical to an extent, but not nearly on the same level as the top-tier threats. We have to talk about Miguel Prado, one of Dexter's closest brushes with a real partner in crime. Initially, Miguel was an ally, a high-profile prosecutor who admired Dexter's vigilante sense of justice. But that partnership twisted into something ugly when Miguel realized how powerful it felt to decide who lives and who dies. He became manipulative, tried to push Dexter's boundaries, and got dangerously comfortable with murder. This wasn't just a physical threat, it was personal. Miguel knew Dexter was close to him and had resources within the legal system. Dexter had to maneuver carefully to protect his identity and keep the code intact. Ultimately, Dexter recognized that Miguel had gone off the rails. Their final confrontation was a heartbreak in some ways, but it had to be done. I'd say that puts Miguel Prado in the danger zone. He was a serious adversary, mainly because of his personal connection and ability to strike at Dexter's life from within. On the simpler side of the spectrum, there's A.J. Yates, a kidnapper who rigged a twisted medical-themed lair. He drilled holes in his victims, hooking them up to all sorts of horrifying contraptions. That's undeniably disturbing, but it only got him so far. Once Dexter discovered the pattern, particularly the medical equipment angle, he zeroed in on Yates. This was no grand chess match. Yates was more monstrous than cunning. A bit of careful planning on Dexter's part, and Yates stood little chance. So that's short work, plain and simple. Now it's time to tackle a giant. Arthur Mitchell, the infamous Trinity Killer. If you watch that season, you know how close Arthur came to ripping Dexter's world apart. By day, he was a community leader, building houses for charity, a family man who seemed normal enough. Beneath that facade, he was systematically killing in cycles. Mother, sister, daughter, father, repeating the trauma of his own childhood. Dexter felt a twisted kinship with Arthur, even tried to learn from him, but that closeness let Arthur slip right into Dexter's personal life, culminating in a devastating tragedy. To me, Arthur stands as one of Dexter's greatest foes, both psychologically and emotionally. He was cunning, had the ultimate double life, and struck where it hurt the most. That's undisputed. Nightmare fuel. He nearly destroyed Dexter in every conceivable way. Finally, we have Brian Moser, the ice truck killer, Dexter's own biological brother. That reveal alone was chilling enough, but then you realize Brian was orchestrating kills specifically to get Dexter's attention, leaving behind meticulously staged body parts as messages. He was brilliant in his savagery, urging Dexter to abandon Harry's code and embrace a shared darkness. That emotional bond made it extremely dangerous for Dexter to do what needed to be done. Brian was almost the pure reflection of what Dexter might have become if Harry hadn't taken him in and shaped his behavior. This confrontation forced Dexter to choose which path he truly wanted. The heartbreak of that choice, paired with Brian's raw manipulative power, cements him as nightmare fuel. He's the ghost that's always in the corner of Dexter's mind. So, there you have it, a rundown of some of Dexter's most notorious kills, from the monstrous masterminds who nearly broke him to the opportunistic psychos who barely knew what hit them. Fascinating, isn't it? I've got more rankings and deep dives where this came from, so if you're as hooked as I am on analyzing dark characters, you'll want to stick around for the next one. Don't forget to subscribe. You don't want to miss the next video. After all, you never know which killer or hero might step into the spotlight next.